All right, thanks so much, Carrie. I'm Liz Boyle, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota and the principal investigator on IPUMS DHS. And with me today are Miriam King, who's also a principal investigator on IPUMS DHS, as well as the project manager, and Meher Munir, who is a research scientist on the project, Neil Rotem, who is a research assistant on the project, and Kari Williams, who's helping run everything. So I want to say welcome to this IPUMS DHS webinar, which is going to focus on how IPUMS DHS simplifies the use of the demographic and health surveys. It's going to focus on how the IPUMS DHS simplifies demographic and health surveys, reproductive calendar data. And we're delighted that you could join us this morning, or whatever time it is where you happen to be, whether you're entirely new to the reproductive calendar data or you have used only the DHS version. We think you're going to find this webinar helpful. So let me start with just a little bit of technical information, so that you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we look forward to your questions throughout the webinar presentation. I'm going to break for questions and answers about 3 times during the presentation, but you should feel free to post your questions at any time, and Miriam and Meher and Nir are going to be kind of sorting through those. Now, we may not be able to get to all of your questions today, and we'll respond to folks individually afterward if we can't answer your questions during the next hour. And I also want to mention that this webinar will be recorded, is being recorded and will be posted soon online. And there'll also be a complete question and answer document that accompanies it, as well as some user notes with data code that you'll find useful for using the IPUMS DHS calendar data. I also want to take a moment to thank our incredibly important partners. Our funder is the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and we're very appreciative of their willingness to support this program. And I also want to thank all of the individuals at the DHS program who have been a constant source of information and support for IPUMS DHS. And both of these partners get credit for every wonderful thing that comes out of IPUMS DHS. Hopefully you won't encounter any errors, or at least many errors in the data. But if you ever do, I do want to mention that that's 100% our responsibility. Oh, and I also want to quickly thank Matt Gunther and Maria Batsiaravara, who really did a lot of the work to get the calendar data ready for IPUMS DHS. All right, with that background, let's jump into today's webinar. What I'm going to be talking about today is first just an introduction to the reproductive calendar data to get you familiar with it and understand what it is. Then focusing on IPUMS. First, I'm going to talk about how IPUMS simplifies use of the calendar data. And then I'm going to get more into the details of how to use the IPUMS DHS calendar data to the best effect. And finally, I'll provide a few additional considerations that you should be thinking about when you're using the calendar data, or the IPUMS DHS calendar data in particular. All right, so let's start with an introduction to the reproductive calendar data. And here I want to help you understand why people are so excited about the calendar data. I'm also going to give you some information on the Demographic and Health Survey Program and the surveys that they've been administering for years, because, of course, they are the creators of the calendar data, and details about the calendar data, such as how it's collected. All right, so for you to understand the importance of the calendar data, let's talk about some research that's been done with the calendar data. There's lots of exciting possibilities, and you can look at the DHS program website publications page for even more ideas about how people are using this data. Of course, reproductive calendar data is used to understand contraceptive use. So many look at issues such as contraceptive switching Here's an article highlighted by Ali and Cleland that appeared in 2010 in Studies in Family Planning on contraceptive switching. And analysts also extensively study contraceptive discontinuation, as in this study by Stevens et al., which was also in Studies in Family Planning, that looks at how health conditions can affect contraceptive discontinuation. Many researchers are also interested in contraceptive failure, and a recent article that came out on this by Bradley and others is Global Contraceptive Failure Rates, which individuals are most at risk. And as that suggests, it's looking at which women experience the highest failure rates across different sorts of methods. Researchers also look at birth spacing, and birth spacing can have lots of implications. So of course you could look at what leads to particular types of birth spacing. I wanted to highlight a couple of articles that look at the impact of birth spacing. So sometimes individuals will research the effect of birth spacing on health outcomes, such as this article by Kanaugia et al. In a study in Social Science Medicine, Population Health, that looks at whether there's a relationship between short spans of birth spacing and low birth weight in children. Researchers also look at whether birth spacing has effects on the health of a mother. So this article by Maxwell et al. Looks at intimate partner violence and how that might be affected or by pregnancy spacing. Research that's also very timely and interesting is about pregnancy termination and infecundity. So not only, researchers don't only study birth and contraception with the reproductive health calendar, they also study issues such as the inability to have children. An interesting article by Krianja et al. Studied abortion, so contraceptive discontinuation and failure, and subsequent abortion in Romania. When women experience, when women stop using contraceptives, are they more likely to have an abortion after that? And also an interesting article by Polis et al. Estimates infertility across low-income countries. So when women are sexually active and have stopped using contraceptives, what percentage of those women don't get pregnant within a certain period of time, such as 6 months, which suggests infecundity. So I hope after seeing some of these examples that you're beginning to understand all of the valuable things that you can do with the calendar data. Now I want to step back and just talk a little bit more specifically about what the calendar data is. All right. The original DHS calendar data, of course, started with the DHS program and the demographic and health surveys. Let's talk a little bit about DHS. I think some of you are probably here because you are familiar with IPUMS, but you're not so familiar with DHS. And so for you, I want to give you a little bit of background on DHS. So the demographic and health survey data collection dates back to the 1980s up to the present. The surveys cover over 90 countries, and they're administered about every 5 years. Now, IPUMS DHS doesn't have all of the surveys yet. We've focused on Africa and South Asia, so we have about 41 countries, and eventually, actually in the next year, we're going to be going global and picking up all regions of the world. DHS data initially focused only on samples of women of childbearing age. Since then, they've expanded their samples to include children under 5, men and couples. But the calendar data still focuses primarily on women of childbearing age. The demographic and health survey data covers many health topics related to women and children. You saw in the articles that I just mentioned that some people use the DHS data to study anemia, other people use it to study intimate partner violence. Lots of people use it to study food insecurity and nutrition. So there are all kinds of different health topics covered by the DHS. And the DHS is the basis for other important surveys, like UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster surveys and the performance monitoring for action surveys that were funded by the Gates Foundation. And here again, I want to just mention that IPUMS Global Health already has an IPUMS PMA project where you can go and review the data, the performance monitoring for action data, and that includes calendar data. And very soon, we're going to be bringing an IPUMS mix online as well. So having these three surveys together, DHS, mix, and PMA, really makes the Global Health Project powerful. All right, let's now focus specifically on the calendar data coming from the DHS. All right, you may be wondering, well, what exactly is the calendar data? So the formal definition is that the calendar data is a month-by-month retrospective report of a woman's pregnancies, births, contraceptive use, and discontinuation, as well as sometimes other information. The calendar data is retrospective for 60 months or 5 years, usually. Sometimes the timing is a little bit different, but for most surveys, it's a 5-year calendar. And the reason that the DHS calendar data is so valuable is it takes cross-sectional data and provides a longitudinal component within that cross-sectional data. Now, there are different categories of DHS surveys, and these can be grouped into 3 broad categories. And the different categories have different amounts of information on the woman's reproductive calendar. So some countries only focus on pregnancies and births, and that's the only information that you're going to see in the calendar data. Most countries also include information on contraceptive use and the continuation or discontinuation of contraceptives. So that's the second category. And then quite a few, particularly recent surveys, also include reasons for contraceptive discontinuation. And so it's important to note that not all calendar data variables are available for all surveys. All right. Now, this is stepping back even further and looking at how the calendar data is collected, because that really helps. I think that really helps you understand what the calendar data is. So it's very hard to read because it's very small, but this is the form that has years, months, and then 2 columns for different information. The first column is generally births, pregnancies, and contraceptive use, and the second column would be reasons for contraceptive discontinuation. Well, let's focus in on 2014. What we see here is that this woman gave birth in October of 2014. We also can see that she was pregnant for the 9 months previous to that. And we can see that she was using some kind of contraceptive method prior to her pregnancy. This is one of the things about the original DHS data. It would depend on the sample what the L means. So sometimes L means lactational amenorrhea, and sometimes it means rhythm method. But she was using a contraceptive method. And we know that there's a code, a 1, for a reason for discontinuation, which probably means that she discontinued because she got pregnant. And we'll talk more about what these codes mean later on. But in general, the interviewer goes to women and asks them questions like, for each reported birth during the previous 5 years, what was the month of the birth and the number of months of the pregnancy? And did you or your partner ever use a method to avoid getting pregnant? And if the woman says yes, what was the method and when did you start and stop using the method? And then why did you stop using the method? So that gives you a sense of the kinds of questions that are used to fill out these columns. So that's a lot on the calendar data, the basics of the calendar data. You can find out more about the specifics of the original demographic and health reproductive calendar data at the DHS program website. And this might be a good time to stop for questions to see if anyone's wondering about issues related to these foundational data. So Miriam, do we have any questions at this point?
I think the only question really that's come up so far is a question about whether this recording will be made available after the fact for people to share with their students and colleagues and others. And happy to say yes, as Liz mentioned, this is being recorded, and there will be a link to this full webinar and the questions and answers that come up available through the IPUMS DHS website and also through the online webinars on the general IPUMS website. So there is a lot of information covered here quickly. So even those of you who are in the virtual room may want to revisit this and of course share with your colleagues and students. But that's it.
Great, thank you. Okay, good. Let's continue then to IPUMS DHS, which is a simpler alternative to the original DHS data. All right. So IPUMS DHS is a collection of consistently coded and documented DHS data available for free over the internet. And as I mentioned, IPUMS DHS is one component of IPUMS Global Health. The advantages of IPUMS DHS are harmonized variables and harmonized geography. And what do we mean by harmonization in this case? Well, harmonization means consistent variable names and codes across all samples. So for example, in the original DHS, the religion variable often has different codes for this, the same religion. In one sample, one might mean Christian. In another sample, one might mean Muslim. In IPUMS DHS, all those codes are going to be consistent across all samples. The same is definitely true of the codes for contraceptive methods, which also vary a lot across countries, but do not vary at all across the samples in IPUMS DHS. Now, with respect to harmonized geography, if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd recommend the webinar that we offered 2 years ago, that you go back and take a look at that. But harmonized geography means that even if regions change within a country, IPUMS DHS geographers have gone back and created a common footprint so that individuals can compare regions across time. Usually what they do is the least common denominator. So they take regions that were later split apart and put them together. But the geography is quite precise around those harmonized geographic regions. Another advantage of IPUMS DHS besides harmonization is data discovery. So it's easy to determine which samples have which variables. And as I mentioned, there's 3 different kinds of contraceptive calendars. And so it's really nice to know whether or not you've got one of the ones that only talks about births, pregnancies, and contraceptive use, or whether you're dealing with a survey that has all of those different variables, such as reasons for discontinuation. Documentation such as survey text is at the user's fingertips. And so you can see if there's changes in question wording across surveys. And we also include cross-sample identifiers, which I find very useful. So for example, weighting data is very important when you're using the DHS because of the 2-stage sampling design, you need to use the complex weighting structure that's available, for example, in Stata. And to do that, you need to use variables like the primary sampling unit. In the original DHS, the primary sampling unit numbers would be redundant across samples. They might run from like 1 to 98 or something. And one country would have 1 to 98, and the next country would also have 1 to 76 or something. In IPUMS DHS, we have a variable called IDHS PSU that makes sure that all of those are unique, So when you're running the complex sampling command in Stata, it will uniquely identify whether you are in this sample or that sample. All right, so those are just some of the basic advantages of IPUMS DHS. And these are the samples and countries that are currently in IPUMS DHS. Right now, we have 170 samples from 41 countries, and we focused on Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. All right, now let's talk about IPUMS DHS and the calendar data. So IPUMS DHS makes the calendar data so much simpler. Now, I want to go back to that survey form that you saw earlier. We went over how the calendar data are collected a moment ago. And so I want you to realize that what we're looking at now is the survey. And then I want to show you what this looks like in the actual data. So this is 5 lines from the IR file in the original DHS. Each line represents a woman. And what you're looking at is one of the calendar variables. So the calendar variables are a single string variable with 80 characters. So for example, this is one single variable, and you can see that it's a combination of numbers, zeros, and letters. And sometimes there's even Greek characters and things like that in these variables as well. Again, you know from the survey that what we're seeing here is births, pregnancies that resulted in births. So the first woman had 2 pregnancies during the calendar period. The second woman had only 1 pregnancy, and the next 2 women did not have any births during the period. But one of these women did in fact have a pregnancy that did not end in a birth, but in fact was terminated in the 3rd month. The other thing that you can see in this data are periods of contraceptive use. Now, we don't know exactly what 1, 5, and N mean, but it does mean that these women were using contraceptives at different periods. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the steps that IPUMS eliminates. So when you're using the original data, there's certain steps you have to take that are kind of complicated, and you can skip those in IPUMS DHS. And then also provide some information on some helpful tools. Okay. So some complicated steps are unnecessary with IPUMS DHS. And I'm going to go through what these steps are, but I want to kind of emphasize that you don't have to 100% understand how these steps work, because you don't have to do them if you're using IPUMS DHS. So the first step is you have to destring the data if you're using the original data. So as I mentioned, all of the calendar variables for women are kind of mushed together in a 80-character long string variable. And the first step with the original DHS data is to explode those strings into 80 separate variables. So here you're, taking just here I'm just showing you a fraction of what that looks like, but I'm creating 60 variables that are called MO01 up to MO60, meaning month 1, month 2, month 3, and I'm providing a code for those. Now, this isn't going to have, you aren't going to have to do this with IPUMS DHS, because all those variables are already separated and have nice names, and they don't have L's or P's, they're zeros or ones, and reflect what actually happened in that month. The second step that's required with the original DHS is a change in data format. So the data comes in a wide format, which means that you have the woman's information and then a long string of 60 variables following her that are all on the same row. It's kind of hard for most statistical programs to use the data in that format, and so it has to be changed into a long format, which means that every month in a woman's calendar becomes its own row in the data. Again, this is a step that's unnecessary in IPUMS DHS because you're already going to receive the data in the long format. And the final step that's unnecessary in IPUMS DHS is putting the data in time order. So you may have noticed in the data that I was showing earlier, that births always appear on the left, and then the pregnancies appear on the right. So it seems like the birth is happening before the pregnancies. And so in the original DHS data, you have to take the data and you have to reverse it, turn it around. But that, again, is not necessary in IPUMS DHS because the data is already in the correct sequential order. Okay, so those are the things you don't have to do. Now let's talk about some of the useful new features that DHS provides. So one of the things that I think is really cool is there are some new variables that make it easier to work with the calendar data. First, there are count variables, which say how many times an event happened in the 5-year period. So that there are count variables for the total number of births, the total number of terminated pregnancies, the total months in which a woman used any kind of contraception, and the total months in which a woman was pregnant. We've also added censoring variables, and these represent incomplete events. So for example, if you go back 60 months from the time of the interview, you might have a woman who was pregnant at that time, but her entire pregnancy isn't going to be reflected in the data. And so that's called left censoring. It's just part of a pregnancy. Likewise, the woman might be pregnant while you're interviewing her. And again, this is, you're not going to understand the entire pregnancy at that point because only part of the pregnancy has happened. That's called right censoring. And so a lot of people want to eliminate left censoring and right censoring cases when they're doing their analysis, and they just want to focus on those complete pregnancies. For example, perhaps pregnancies that did in fact end in a birth. And so the censoring variables make it easy for people to keep only the complete events. And then Miriam and her team have also created categorical variables. So for example, all the possible reproductive events that can happen in a month. Was there a birth? Was there a pregnancy? Was there contraceptive use, or was there no contraceptive use, for example? Those categorical variables can also be very helpful. There's lots of additional benefits as well. So as I already mentioned, there's consistent numeric codes for every variable across samples. So you don't have to worry about what L means in Mali versus what L means in Yemen. It's going to be a number, and it's going to be the same thing. Zeros are a little tricky in the original DHS data. In fact, they're still a little tricky even in IPUMS DHS. But one of the things that Miriam and her team have done is distinguish between whether a zero means no, or whether it means that a woman wasn't asked a particular question, so is not in the universe of the people who were surveyed. Household variables are available without merging files, and there's easy data discovery, so you can easily see which questions were asked. All right, so perhaps many of you have already been to dhs.ipums.org. If you haven't, now might be a good time to go there and explore. But I'm going to walk through the steps. First, I'm going to walk through the steps that allow you to access the calendar data, and then which is the same way that you access any data in IPUMS DHS. And then I'm going to talk about some of the ways to use the data. All right. So when you're at dhs.ipums.org, you want to start with the get data and creating an extract. So click on that button. And then you need to choose your unit of analysis. If you are interested in the calendar data, you're going to want to choose woman months. But for researchers who are interested in other issues, you can also choose women, children, births, household members, men, and woman months. And you can see that these kind of correspond to the files that are available with the original DHS data. By the way, household members can be turned into households if you just select line number 1, people who are on line number 1, because line number 1 is always the household head, and then you'll have all the information on each household, but only one bit of information on that household. All right, but let's talk about woman months. Now, after you've selected your unit of analysis, the next thing you'll want to do is at the top of the screen, you want to log in using your DHS program credentials. So everyone who gets access to the IPUMS DHS data has to have access to the original DHS data. And we have instructions at our login site if you haven't registered for the DHS data previously. Next thing you do is you select samples and variables, and here's what the screen is going to look like there. So here's where you select your samples. And samples that you have access to are those that you specifically requested access to through the DHS program. Those will be shown in green, and samples you don't have access to will be shown in gray. And this is where you select your variables. In the topics drop-down menu, you'll see that there's a special section just for calendar variables. Next, I'm going to show you a page that has, this is the family planning calendar variables, which is just a small portion of the calendar variables. And I've picked Benin 2017, Mali 2018, and Nigeria 2018, just to provide an example. So one of the things that you can see with these X's, as it says here, an X indicates the variable is available in that data set. So, and samples in green are available to you. So all these samples are available to me. And all of these samples have all of the variables that we're looking at over here. So what that suggests is that these are some of the more, the third category of calendar data that have all of the information. All right, now the next thing I wanted to mention to you is it's really, really important. I can't emphasize this enough. With IPUMS DHS, every variable name is a link, and it provides a link to the documentation for that variable. And there's so much important information there. And especially because the calendar data is complicated, even though we've made it easy to access, it's still complicated to use that data. I think it's very, very important that you actually review all of the documentation for the variables that you're selecting. Also wanted to point out over here that if you want to select all of these variables, all of this particular group of calendar variables, these two little double plus signs allow you to do that. But let's go on and look at I'm going to click on Cal Reason, and we're going to see some of the documentation related to that. Okay, so the first thing that's important is the data description, which tells you what this variable means. So this is a variable, this is actually for Cal contraceptive use, and that not for the Cal Reason, but it shows you a description. And then we go to comparability. And here is comparability, and this goes into quite a bit of detail about the blanks and how to code nines, how to think about zeros, how to think about 99s. And in this documentation, Miriam's not telling you precisely what to do. She's telling you what, if you make different choices, what those choices are assuming about the data. And so ultimately you need to make those choices. But there are some issues about how you treat missing values, how you treat zeros, and you're going to want to think about those things. And the documentation for the variables really helps with that. Then if we look at the codes, this is the kind of composite code that Miriam was talking about. So this again is the reasons for contraceptive discontinuation. And this isn't actually all of the categories because I ran out of space. This is just categories from 1 to 41. But what you can see here are the composite codes that Miriam talked about. So you might have just a general discussion of side effects, which is true. A general mention of side effects as a reason for discontinuation, and that in fact is true in all of the cases here. But you might also have some more specific detail. So for example, for other method-related reasons, I discontinued contraception. wanted a more effective method is pretty consistent across countries, as is I found this method inconvenient to use. Now I added in Jordan 12 because it has some unique responses under other method related reasons for discontinuing that include the method expired, and that I ended breastfeeding, period returned. So something that's kind of specific to lactational amenorrhea. And yeah, so we just focused on other methods, and I mentioned how Jordan had some unique categories there. The other thing I just want to point out again here to reinforce what Miriam already mentioned is that 30 is the general category. And when you're recoding your data, you can just have everything in the 30s means other method related. But if you want to be more specific, there's a 3.1, a 3.2, a 3.3, a 3.4, and all the 30s are related. They all fall under this broad category, but each specific digit provides us different other method related reason. Okay, and if you have any questions about that, feel free to put them in the chat, because I know that it is a little bit complicated, but it's, I think, a real benefit of IPUMS DHS. All right, now we're ready to check out, and to do that, you click on View Your Data Cart. So this looks like you're shopping at Amazon or something, except that everything is free, but you click on cart and you're going to be able to see your variables and your samples. As you're checking out, I just want to mention one thing, and that is at this point, you can change your data format, and I recommend you look closely to see whether this is the format that you want. So it's this line, and it says right now that the data format that you're going to get is .dat, which is the default format. If you want to get a DTA file because you use Stata, then you should click change and you'll have the option to do Stata or SPSS. I believe DAT will work okay with R, but we have some information about that on the website. All right. Now let's turn to some examples that use the IPUMS DHS calendar data to show you what you can do with the calendar data. Okay. First off, the data is going to come to you in default in the long format. And what does the long format mean? That means that each row is a month of time. So if you think back to when you selected your unit of analysis, I said to select woman month. That means each row is going to be a month of time. Data in this format is ideal for studying trends, and it's the basis for event history models or hazard models. And so this is a great way to receive the data, and you can do a lot of things with data in this way. Okay, I want to show you an example. So when we post this webinar and post the user notes, the first example in our calendar data user notes is going to be creating this survivor curve. So let's start with what is a survivor curve? So survivor curves go back to medical research when doctors would introduce a particular treatment and then see whether that extended the life of individuals who were on that treatment. So maybe individuals have a diagnosis of cancer and a treatment is introduced, and then the survivor curve looks at the percentage of individuals who are surviving after a certain amount of time. So that's where the survivor idea comes from. And when an individual who was part of that trial passed away, that was called a failure. And so that's where if you work with survival curves, you're going to hear those terms survival and failure, and that's where those come from. This is looking at contraceptive discontinuation over time. And so the survival is remaining on contraception across time. So you can see that in Nigeria, the red line, that people were more likely to continue with contraceptives over time compared to Mali. Now, there's a couple of things to mention about this example. So this is in use of any contraception. And I think it would actually be better to look at more specific methods. Exactly what it means to continue on any form of contraception is pretty broad. Second thing I want you to notice as you're looking at this data is you might see how there's these kind of drop-offs that are a little bit steep at each of these points. These are at month 12, at month 24, at month 36, and so forth. And what you're seeing there is probably some fuzziness in people's memory, and so they just go, oh, that was a year ago. And so there's some heaping around the years. What that's called is recall bias. And lots of folks have done research on the recall bias related to the calendar data, and suggest that the calendar data works best for long-acting methods, because people may not remember 4.5 years ago whether they were like using condoms or things like that, but they probably will remember if they were using injectables or that kind of contraceptive. All right, so you can find the information for how to make these kinds of curves. Again, I'd probably recommend that you do it for a particular type of contraceptive rather than all contraceptives, but the example will help you do that. Here's another example. Whoops, skipped over it. And thank you to Nia for doing this one. This is the percent of women becoming pregnant while using family planning. On the left, we have injectables, and on the right, we have the pill. One of the things that's nice about this, again, is that it's showing a comparative analysis, and you can see on the left that the likelihood of the percentage of women who became pregnant while on injectables is much lower than the percentage of women who became pregnant while using the pill. But the other thing you can see is that there's quite a bit of variation across countries for both types of data. And the numbers underlying these maps are coming from exercise 2 of the long format user note that will be available with this recording. Now, we had a question about using event data in event format and whether it comes in event format. Let's talk about what that means. What is event format? So start with some terms. An event means a change to a new state, for example, becoming pregnant, starting a new type of contraception, having a birth. Those are all events. When you talk about an event, you also have to talk about an episode, which means the length of time or duration in this state. So, for example, the length of time might be the time that you are pregnant. It might be the time between births. So birth spacing. And then, and what event files are good for studying is what happens before or after an episode or event. And then it's also good for calculating duration rates, such as the 12-month method discontinuation rate. In an event data file, each row, rather than being a woman month, each row is an event with an episode, and it's going to include the starting event, the month the episode started, the month the episode stopped, the episode duration length, and events that precede or follow the episode. And we will also be providing data code on how to create event files, and we have an example of how to use event files if you want to have the data in that format. Here's some examples of some questions that you would ask. How many women switch to a new method after stopping one type? And how does this vary across the type of method? Another would be, are short birth spacing intervals associated with lower birth weights? And again, just to mention that in both DHS and IPUMS DHS, you have to do a bit of data manipulation to get the file into event format. All right, so those are some examples of how you can use IPUMS DHS, and you can see how those are related to the articles that we saw at the very beginning of this presentation. So you're going to be able to do those kinds of analyses yourself. Now, I want to talk about a few additional considerations. A limitation of the calendar data, which I mentioned when I was talking about the survival curve, is recall bias. So research does show that the calendar data are most accurate for older women, for women who don't switch methods frequently, and for long-acting methods. And so those are some things to think about when you're using the calendar data. If you're looking at, say, short-acting methods, you may want to restrict the time period. Maybe you only want to look at the last 24 months rather than looking at the entire last 60 months. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend the DHS methodological report number 17, which is available on the DHS program website. Another consideration when you're using IPUMS DHS calendar data is that these are very large files because every woman has now has 60 rows. And so we have some recommendations. If you have a slow internet connection and you think it might be difficult to download very large files, one thing is that there are free browser extensions out there that facilitate large downloads. So if the download is interrupted, you can come back to it later and continue without having to start all over again. One of those extensions that works for Chrome and Firefox is Download Them All. And Download Them All is all one word, and it has an exclamation point after the end of it. And NIR has used that and recommends it, says it works effectively. Another strategy is to download only one sample at a time. And we recommend if you're downloading the India sample, because that is such a large sample, that probably is a good idea to just download by itself and then append to other samples if you're going to include other samples as well in your research. The final additional consideration is I just wanted to go back to IPUMS PMA to say that this is another source of calendar data. IPUMS PMA is available at pma.ipums.org. And these are frequent turnaround surveys. So one of the things that's interesting is they can do shorter calendars because they're talking to women more frequently. So that I highly recommend that you check out that calendar data as well. And then IPUMS PMA has all kinds of tools, which like the DHS calendar data tutorial are also super useful. And so you could learn on your own by checking out the IPUMS PMA Data Analysis Hub blog, which has an entry on making the contraceptive calendar data work for you. All right. Well, thank you for an engaging discussion. I hope you've found this webinar interesting and useful. Feel free to spend the next few minutes entering in additional questions. And as I said, we'll be creating a Q&A document that will include all of the questions that were asked during the webinar. Thanks again for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. And all of you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week.